It's Groundhog Day. You know that day where we all wait to see if that furry little guy in Pennsylvania will see his shadow and predict 6 more weeks of winter?
Ah, yes, Punxsutawney Phil and all that.
Exactly. But honestly, I think there are some bigger shadows looming on the horizon right now. Things that could impact us far more than a slightly longer winter.
I couldn't agree more. While everyone's focused on whether or not we'll have an early spring, we're seeing some pretty major developments in global trade, and the aftershocks of Brexit are still rippling outward.
Yeah, those are the stories that could have real staying power, not just for a few weeks, but for years to come. So how about we ditch the furry weatherman for a bit and dive into some actual news that matters?
Sounds good to me.
Right, so first up, trade wars. And honestly, I'm getting some serious deja vu here. Didn't we already go through this a few years ago with all the tariffs and trade tensions?
We did, but this time it feels different. The trade tensions we're seeing now, they really have the potential to escalate into a full-blown global trade war.
Oh, wow. Okay, so you're saying this isn't just a repeat of the Trump tariff saga. What makes this round potentially worse?
Well, for one thing, the stakes are much higher. Global supply chains are so interconnected now more than ever before. And any disruption could have a ripple effect across industries and economies. Plus, we're seeing a rise in protectionist policies around the world.
Yeah, that's true. It seems like every country is looking out for themselves these days. So how are countries reacting to this new wave of trade tension? Is everyone just bracing for impact?
Some countries are definitely taking a more aggressive stance than others. Canada, for example, is talking about retaliating dollar for dollar against any tariffs imposed by the U.S.
Wow, dollar for dollar. That sounds pretty serious. I mean, are they really willing to risk escalating things further?
It seems like they're reaching a breaking point. Mark Carney, who's a potential future prime minister of Canada, he even called out the U.S. for bully tactics. And he's not just some random politician. He's also the former governor of the Bank of England.
Right. So when someone like that makes a statement like that, it definitely carries some weight.
Absolutely. It signals a shift in the global balance of power and a willingness to stand up to the U.S.
So this isn't just some abstract economic policy debate. It's getting personal.
It definitely is. And that could have some interesting implications for how this whole trade war plays out.
Okay, so let's bring this back down to earth for a minute. What does all of this mean for regular people? Are we going to start seeing price hikes on everything?
Well, when tariffs are imposed, those costs often get passed down to consumers in the form of higher prices. So yeah, we could start seeing price increases on a whole range of goods, everything from cars and electronics to food and clothing.
So maybe we should all start stocking up on essentials now, just in case.
It might not be a bad idea.
Okay, but before we all head to the supermarket, I'm curious about something. You mentioned that some countries are considering targeting specific companies with retaliatory tariffs. Is that even possible?
It's definitely being discussed. One example that's been floated is Elon Musk's Tesla.
Tesla? Why Tesla? I mean, there are a lot of companies with ties to the U.S. government.
Tesla is particularly vulnerable because it relies heavily on global supply chains and exports to key markets like China. Hitting Tesla with tariffs could disrupt its production and sales, potentially harming its stock value.
Ah, I see. So it's not just about inflicting economic pain, it's about strategic targeting. They're going after companies that could exert pressure from within the U.S.
Exactly. And the electric vehicle market is still relatively young and volatile, so any disruption could have a significant impact on its growth trajectory.
This whole trade war situation sounds like it could get pretty messy.
It definitely has the potential to, and it's something you'll want to keep an eye on because it could have very real consequences for your wallet.
Okay, enough doom and gloom for one day. Let's shift gears to something a little less explosive, at least on the surface. It's been 5 years now since the UK decided to go it alone and leave the EU.
Brexit. Has it really been that long?
It has. So how's it actually playing out? All those promises of a brighter future outside the EU, have they materialized?
Well, it's been a mixed bag, to be honest. There have been some unexpected wins and losses. It's not the disaster that some predicted, but it's not exactly a smooth sailing success story either.
Okay, so give us the highlights. What are the biggest areas where Brexit has really made an impact?
I think we can break it down into 5 key areas: trade, immigration, travel laws, and money.
All right, let's start with trade. That was a big sticking point during the whole Brexit debate. So what's the verdict?
Well, the UK's exit from the EU single market has definitely created some significant challenges, particularly for businesses trying to export goods.
So it's not as simple as just slapping a Made in Britain label on a product and shipping it off to Europe anymore.
Not at all. We're seeing a lot of new non-tariff barriers popping up, things like regulatory differences, customs procedures, and quotas.
Ah, the joys of bureaucracy.
Exactly. All of this adds complexity and cost, which is a real headache for many businesses, especially small ones that don't have the resources to navigate all the new red tape.
That makes sense. What about businesses that focus on services like finance or consulting? Are they feeling the pain too?
Interestingly, the services sector has actually been doing surprisingly well post-Brexit.
Really? Why is that?
It seems that UK expertise in areas like finance and consulting is still in high demand even outside the EU.
So it's a bit of a tale of two cities then. Goods exporters are struggling while service providers are thriving. What about immigration? I know that was a huge issue during the whole Brexit debate.
It was, and the results have been interesting, to say the least. As you might expect, immigration from EU countries to the UK has dropped since Brexit.
So the take back control of our borders argument seems to have played out as planned.
On the surface, yes. But here's where it gets interesting. Immigration from non-EU countries, particularly for work visas and students, has actually gone up.
Oh, wow. So the UK is becoming more diverse, just not in the way some people might have expected.
Exactly. The UK government is now trying to manage these numbers carefully, especially when it comes to dependence of work visa holders and students. But the shift in immigration patterns is undeniable.
Fascinating. Okay, so we've got trade and immigration seeing some pretty significant changes. What about travel? Has Brexit made it more complicated to hop across the channel?
For now, things haven't changed drastically, but that's about to change. Both the UK and the EU are in the process of implementing new electronic travel authorization systems.
Wait, so even though the UK is no longer part of the EU, I might still need to apply for some kind of visa to go there.
Not exactly visa, but a travel authorization. It's similar to the ESTA program that the U.S. uses for visitors from certain countries. It's essentially an extra layer of bureaucracy and a way for both the UK and the EU to keep track of who's coming and going.
So more paperwork, more potential for delays. Doesn't sound very fun.
It does add a bit of hassle to the travel experience, unfortunately. But on the plus side, at least you won't have to deal with getting your passport stamped anymore. Everything will be digital.
Small victories, I guess. All right, let's move on to laws. One of the big selling points of Brexit was the promise of a bonfire of EU regulations. Did that actually happen?
Not quite the inferno that some were hoping for.
More like a controlled burn.
A very controlled burn. The UK has retained and tweaked many EU laws, especially those related to things like working conditions and environmental standards.
So they're taking a more pragmatic approach, focusing on areas where they felt EU rules were overly burdensome or didn't align with their national interests.
Exactly.
Interesting. So it's not a complete break from the past, but more of a selective pruning of regulations. Finally, let's talk money. The UK is no longer contributing to the EU budget, but I'm guessing there's more to the financial picture than just that.
You're absolutely right. While the UK has saved billions by not paying into the EU budget, it's also lost access to some valuable EU funding programs.
So there are financial trade-offs on both sides. It's
Right.
not just a simple case of the UK saving a bunch of money.
Exactly. And to complicate things further, the UK recently rejoined the Horizon Research Program.
Hold on, they rejoined. I thought Brexit was all about going their separate ways.
It was, but it seems the UK government realized that there are certain areas where collaboration with the EU is still beneficial. The Horizon program provides access to significant research funding and networks, so rejoining was a strategic move to boost the UK's scientific and technological capabilities.
So it's a bit of a have your cake and eat it too situation.
You could say that the UK is trying to chart its own course, but it's also recognizing that complete isolation from the EU isn't necessarily in its best interests.
Oh, okay, so even something that happened 5 years ago, like Brexit, is still shaping the world today. It's almost like a groundhog seeing its shadow, just on a global scale.
I like that analogy. There's definitely a lot of uncertainty and change swirling around, and it's crucial to understand how these events connect.
Absolutely. It's easy to get caught up in the daily headlines, but taking a deep dive like this helps us see the bigger picture and how it all affects us.
Exactly. And what's particularly fascinating here is how these seemingly separate events, from trade wars to Brexit, are all interconnected.
So what you're saying is that it's all one big messy web.
Precisely. And understanding how those threads connect is essential if we want to make sense of the world around us and anticipate what might be coming next. The UK's exit from the EU has actually given them more freedom to strike their own trade deals.
Oh, really? So Brexit could actually be an advantage if a global trade war does break out.
It's a double-edged sword. On the one hand, the UK is no longer bound by EU trade agreements, so they have more flexibility to negotiate deals that are tailored to their specific interests.
So they could potentially get better deals than they would have gotten if they were still in the EU.
Exactly, especially if they're dealing with countries that are also looking to diversify their own trade relationships.
Makes sense. But what's the catch? There's got to be a downside.
Well, there's no guarantee that these new trade deals will be as beneficial as the trade relationships the UK had within the EU single market.
Right. And plus, negotiating and implementing new trade deals takes time.
Exactly. And the UK is already facing some economic headwinds from Brexit.
So it's a bit of a gamble. They could come out ahead, but there's also a risk that they'll end up worse off.
That's the nature of any gamble.
I guess so. It seems like a lot of this boils down to how well the UK can play its cards in this new global landscape.
Absolutely. And it's not just about the UK. Every country is having to reassess its position and figure out how to navigate these increasingly complex and unpredictable trade dynamics.
It's like everyone's playing a high-stakes game of chess, and the rules keep changing.
That's a great analogy. And it raises an important question. In a world where global trade is becoming increasingly fraught and countries seem to be prioritizing their own interests above all else, what happens to international cooperation?
Yeah, that's a bit worrying. We're already seeing so much division and conflict on the world stage. If countries can't even cooperate on something as fundamental as trade, how are we going to tackle bigger challenges like climate change or global health crises?
It's a valid concern. We're seeing this trend towards nationalism and protectionism in many parts of the world.
Which can be appealing in the short term because it promises to protect domestic industries and jobs.
Exactly. But in the long run, it could lead to a more fragmented and less cooperative world.
Which would make it much harder to address these global challenges that really require collective action.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to understand these issues and how they connect. It's not just about economics or politics. It's about the future of our planet and our ability to work together to solve problems that affect us all.
Okay, that's a pretty sobering thought.
Okay.
We've covered a lot of ground today, from feisty groundhogs to trade wars to the long tail of Brexit. It's a lot to take in.
It is. But these seemingly separate stories are all part of a complex and interconnected world.
What happens on one continent can have ripple effects across the globe.
Exactly. That's why it's so important to stay informed and engaged.
You know, it's funny. We started this whole conversation talking about Groundhog Day. And I think there's actually a deeper connection here than I initially realized.
Oh, really? I'm intrigued. What are you thinking?
Well, Groundhog Day is all about repetition, right?
Yeah.
Phil predicts 6 more weeks of winter. And we all just sort of accept it as part of this quirky tradition.
Right.
But what we've been talking about today, trade wars, Brexit, it's all about breaking patterns, disrupting the status quo. It's like the world is finally waking up and realizing that the old ways of doing things, they might not work anymore.
I like that perspective. It's like we're all emerging from our burrows, blinking into the sunlight of a new reality.
Yeah.
And just like Phil, we're all going to have to adapt to whatever we find out there.
Exactly. And that adaptation, it's not going to be easy. We're talking about some really fundamental shifts in global power, in economic systems, even the way we think about national identity. It's going to be messy. It's going to be unpredictable. There will be winners and losers for sure.
And it's going to require us to be more informed, more engaged than ever before. We can't just sit back and wait for someone else to figure it all out.
We all have a role to play in shaping this new world.
Right.
So to everyone listening out there, don't just take this information in and then move on with your day. Let it spark your curiosity. Do your own research. Have conversations with people who hold different perspectives. Because the future isn't something that just happens to us. It's something we create together.
Well said. And remember, even though the world can feel overwhelming at times, there's still beauty and hope to be found out there. So stay curious, stay engaged, and keep searching for those glimmers of light.
Beautifully put. That's a perfect note to end on. Until next time, stay informed, stay engaged, and maybe keep an eye out for those unexpected opportunities. You never know what might pop up when the world is in a state of flux.
And who knows, maybe those opportunities will lead to something truly amazing, something that benefits us all. Just like a sunny spring day after a long winter.